On a quiet Saturday afternoon in Greenwich, David Mitchell knelt beneath the kitchen island of a sprawling mansion, wrestling with a stubborn burst pipe. His 7-year-old daughter Sophie sat cross-legged nearby, sketching with a broken crayon. The $40 an hour maintenance worker had no idea that 16-year-old Amelia Whitman was watching from the living room doorway for the first time in 6 months. When David sat down on the cold marble beside his daughter to help her draw, something extraordinary happened. Amelia drifted closer, silent as a ghost, and for the first time since her world shattered, she picked up a pencil. What happened next would accomplish something that 8 of the world's most expensive therapists couldn't. Dr. Patricia Morrison had charged $5,000 per session and failed to coax even a whisper from Amelia's lips. Richard Whitman had spent over $300,000 on specialists who promised miracles but delivered nothing. But sometimes healing doesn't come from the most qualified hands. The Whitman estate sprawled across 15 manicured acres in Greenwich, Connecticut, its white colonial facade gleaming like polished marble in the afternoon sun. Behind the imposing iron gates and perfectly trimmed hedges lived a silence so complete it seemed to absorb sound itself. Mrs. Henderson, the family's long-time housekeeper, moved through the mansion's 37 rooms with practiced efficiency, her footsteps muffled by Persian rugs worth more than most people's homes. But no amount of luxury could mask the grief that had settled into every corner of the house like dust. 6 months ago, Catherine Whitman had died in a car accident on the Merritt Parkway, her Mercedes spinning across 3 lanes of traffic before coming to rest against a concrete barrier. Her 16-year-old daughter Amelia had been in the passenger seat, uninjured physically, but shattered in ways that expensive therapy couldn't seem to reach. Richard Whitman dealt with his loss the only way he knew how, by throwing money at the problem and burying himself in work. He hired grief counselors and trauma specialists, art therapists, and behavioral experts, each one more expensive and credentials more impressive than the last. Dr. Patricia Morrison charged $5,000 per session and came highly recommended from Manhattan's most exclusive psychiatric practices. Dr. James Hartford had written 3 books on adolescent trauma and maintained offices in both New York and Los Angeles. None of them could get Amelia to speak more than single-word responses, and most sessions ended with her retreating to her bedroom for days at a time. The girl who had once filled the house with laughter and piano music had become a ghost, drifting through rooms without touching anything, eating meals in silence when she ate at all. Mrs. Henderson watched it all with the helpless frustration of someone who had helped raise Amelia from infancy. She had been with the family for 12 years, had seen the little girl grow from a precocious toddler into a bright, artistic teenager who painted watercolors in the sunroom and played piano duets with her mother. Now that same girl barely acknowledged her existence, moving through the house like she was underwater, unreachable behind a wall of trauma that grew thicker with each failed therapeutic intervention. The housekeeper found herself praying for a miracle, though she wouldn't have recognized one if it arrived carrying a toolbox and wearing work boots. The pipe burst on a Saturday when Richard was in Tokyo negotiating a merger that would add another $100 million to his already vast fortune. Mrs. Henderson discovered the flood when she went to prepare Amelia's lunch tray, finding the kitchen ankle-deep in water that was spreading toward the formal dining room with its priceless antique furniture. She called the emergency plumbing service that the estate management company recommended, her voice tight with the kind of controlled panic that came from managing crises in a house where appearances mattered more than convenience. The dispatcher promised to send someone within the hour, and Mrs. Henderson began the process of moving furniture and calling restoration services, her mind already calculating the cost of repairs that would easily reach into 6 figures. David Mitchell arrived in a 10-year-old Honda Civic that looked embarrassingly shabby against the backdrop of the mansion's circular driveway. He had worked for Greenwich Emergency Plumbing for 3 years, long enough to grow accustomed to the vast wealth of his clients, but never quite comfortable with the stark contrast to his own modest circumstances. His daughter Sophie bounced in the passenger seat beside him, her worn backpack stuffed with coloring books and crayons, Saturday afternoon art supplies that traveled with them when babysitting arrangements fell through. At 7 years old, Sophie possessed the kind of natural confidence that made her equally at home in their small apartment above Chen's Bakery, or the marble foyers of mansion owners who spent more on weekly flower arrangements than David earned in a month. Mrs. Henderson met them at the service entrance, her usual composure cracked by the stress of managing a crisis in Richard's absence. She led them through hallways lined with museum-quality paintings, past rooms filled with furniture that belonged in European palaces, her voice professionally calm as she explained the extent of the damage. The kitchen island had been custom-designed by a renowned architect, its Italian marble surface now partially submerged beneath several inches of murky water that continued to seep from the pipes beneath. Sophie's eyes grew wide at the opulence surrounding them, her small hand gripping David's calloused fingers as she took in crystal chandeliers that cast rainbow patterns across walls decorated with original oil paintings. This wasn't just wealth. This was the kind of money that existed in an entirely different universe from their world of discount groceries and second-hand clothes. David set his toolbox down on the one dry section of counter and began assessing the damage, his practiced eye taking in the scope of work that would be required. The burst pipe was just the beginning. Water had seeped into the subflooring and would likely require extensive restoration work that could take weeks to complete. He explained the situation to Mrs. Henderson in simple terms, watching her face tighten as she calculated the disruption this would cause to the household's careful routines. Sophie found a spot near the window where the marble was still dry and settled cross-legged with her sketchbook, humming softly to herself as she began drawing the elaborate chandelier that hung above the island. Her presence brought an unexpected warmth to the sterile kitchen, a reminder that life could exist and flourish even in the most carefully controlled environments. What none of them noticed was the figure that appeared in the doorway connecting the kitchen to the formal living room. Amelia Whitman stood there like a spectre, her golden hair unwashed and hanging limp around shoulders that seemed too sharp beneath an oversized sweater. She hadn't left her bedroom in 3 days, not since her latest therapy session had ended with Dr. Morrison suggesting that perhaps residential treatment might be necessary. The sound of unfamiliar voices in her house had drawn her downstairs, curiosity overcoming the inertia that had kept her isolated for months. She watched the scene before her with the detached interest of someone observing life through glass, noting the contrast between the maintenance worker's careful professionalism and his daughter's unconscious joy as she created art in the middle of chaos. David worked methodically, his movements efficient and practiced as he shut off water valves and began the process of accessing the damaged pipes. He had learned to tune out his surroundings when working in houses like this, focusing on the technical problems rather than the overwhelming display of wealth that could make him feel inadequate if he dwelt on it too long. But Sophie's presence changed the dynamic, her cheerful chatter and artistic enthusiasm creating a bubble of normalcy that somehow made the intimidating space feel more human. She drew steadily, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration as she tried to capture the complex curves and shadows of the crystal fixture above their heads. The breakthrough came when David's knees finally protested against kneeling on the hard marble floor. He sat back with a slight groan, stretching his legs and rubbing the ache from joints that weren't as young as they used to be. Sophie immediately scooted closer, sensing an opportunity for collaboration that she never passed up. She held up her drawing for his inspection, her face bright with the kind of pride that came from creating something beautiful, regardless of technical perfection. The chandelier in her sketch was recognizable, but decidedly childlike, all bold lines and enthusiastic color choices that captured the spirit of the original, even if the proportions were wildly incorrect. David's face softened as he looked at his daughter's artwork, remembering similar moments from what felt like a lifetime ago, when Maria would critique Sophie's drawings with the same gentle encouragement. He picked up one of Sophie's crayons, a stubby blue one worn down from countless creative sessions, and added careful shading to her chandelier, his larger hands guiding hers as they worked together to bring dimension to the flat drawing. Their heads bent together over the sketchbook, father and daughter lost in the simple pleasure of collaborative creation, unaware that they were being watched by someone who hadn't felt pleasure of any kind in 6 months. Sophie giggled at something David whispered, her laughter echoing in the vast kitchen like music in a cathedral, bright and joyful and completely unconscious of its own impact. Amelia found herself taking a step into the kitchen, then another, drawn by something she couldn't name. There was an intimacy to the scene that had nothing to do with the opulent surroundings, a connection between two people who clearly loved each other and found joy in simple shared activities. She hadn't seen anything like it since before the accident, when her own family had been whole and happy and capable of finding pleasure in everyday moments. The sight was both beautiful and painful, a reminder of everything she had lost and everything that had once seemed possible. Her bare feet made no sound on the wet marble as she moved closer, her presence as ghostly and insubstantial as everything else about her had become. Sophie noticed her first, looking up from their collaborative artwork with the open curiosity of childhood. There was no fear in her expression, no awkwardness or pity, just the natural interest of one artist encountering another. She held out a purple crayon without hesitation, the gesture as simple and profound as any therapeutic intervention that had failed to reach Amelia over the past 6 months. The offer hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and completely free of expectation or demand. David glanced up then, taking in the pale, hollow-eyed girl who stood before them like she might disappear at any moment, understanding instinctively that this was a moment that required the lightest possible touch. Amelia's hand trembled as she reached for the crayon, her fingers brushing against Sophie's warm palm in the first voluntary human contact she had initiated since her mother's funeral. The simple touch sent shock waves through her system, reminding her that she still existed in physical space, that she was still capable of connection even when everything else felt impossible. She knelt down on the cold marble beside them, expensive flaws forgotten in the face of something more valuable than money could buy. For the first time in 6 months, Amelia Whitman chose to be present in her own life, one purple crayon stroke at a time. The three of them worked in comfortable silence, adding colors and details to Sophie's chandelier drawing, while the chaos of burst pipes and standing water faded into background noise. David continued his running commentary about shading and perspective, his voice gentle and instructional without being patronizing or therapeutic. Sophie chatted about her favorite colors and the way light worked in different situations, her observations startlingly sophisticated for someone so young. And Amelia contributed small touches, a hint of shadow here, a suggestion of reflection there, her artistic training evident even in these tentative marks. She said nothing, but her presence was deliberate and engaged in ways that months of expensive therapy had failed to achieve. Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway an hour later, stopping short at the unexpected scene before her. In 6 months of watching Amelia retreat further and further from any kind of engagement with the world, she had never imagined seeing the girl voluntarily participate in any activity, let alone one that involved strangers and took place outside her bedroom. The sight was so unprecedented that the housekeeper found herself holding her breath, afraid that any sound or movement might break whatever spell had brought Amelia into this moment of connection. She retreated as quietly as she had come, leaving them to their collaborative artwork, while she went to call Richard in Tokyo with news that would change everything about how the family understood healing and hope. When David finally had to return to his plumbing work, he left the drawing where it was, understanding instinctively that moving it would somehow break the fragile connection that had been established. Amelia remained kneeling on the marble floor, staring at the collaborative artwork as if it contained secrets to mysteries she had forgotten how to solve. Sophie continued adding details with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of childhood, narrating her creative choices in a steady stream of cheerful commentary that filled the kitchen with warmth. The contrast between the sterile perfection of the mansion and the organic messiness of creative collaboration was striking, highlighting just how much life had been missing from this house since Catherine's death. The repair work proved more extensive than David had initially estimated, requiring multiple trips back to his truck for specialized tools and replacement parts. Each time he returned to the kitchen, he found Amelia still there, sometimes drawing, but more often just watching Sophie work with the intense focus of someone trying to remember how to engage with the world. There was something healing about the child's unconscious artistry, her complete lack of self-doubt or critical judgment as she brought her imagination to life on paper. Sophie drew what she saw and what she felt with equal confidence, creating a visual language that bypassed the intellectual defenses that had made traditional therapy so ineffective for Amelia. By late afternoon, David had managed to stop the immediate flooding and install temporary repairs that would hold until more extensive work could be scheduled for the following week. The kitchen was still partially flooded, but the crisis had been contained, and the damage minimized as much as possible given the circumstances. He began packing his tools while Sophie finished her latest masterpiece, a drawing of all three of them working together, their stick figure representations crude but unmistakably joyful. She tore the page carefully from her sketchbook and offered it to Amelia with the same generous spirit that had characterized all their interactions, unconscious of the magnitude of what she was giving. Amelia accepted the drawing with hands that shook slightly, studying the simple figures that somehow captured something essential about their afternoon together. In Sophie's artistic vision, they were all the same size and importance, connected by shared activity, rather than separated by age or circumstance or the vast economic differences that defined their actual relationship. It was a vision of equality and connection that no amount of money could buy, a reminder that some of the most valuable things in life were available to anyone brave enough to sit on the floor and create something together. When it came time to leave, Sophie hugged Amelia goodbye with the natural affection of someone who had found a kindred spirit, completely unconscious of the fact that she was the first person to embrace the older girl since her mother's funeral. David watched the interaction with the careful attention of someone who understood that small gestures could carry enormous weight, that healing often happened in moments too subtle for professionals to measure or quantify. As they gathered their belongings and prepared to return to their modest apartment, all three of them were somehow different than they had been that morning, connected by an experience that transcended their obvious differences. Mrs. Henderson waited until their Honda had disappeared through the estate gates before calling Richard in Tokyo, her voice carefully controlled as she described what she had witnessed. Richard's response was a mixture of hope and disbelief. After 6 months of expensive failures, the idea that a maintenance worker and his young daughter might have accomplished what teams of specialists could not seemed too good to be true. But Mrs. Henderson's account was detailed and credible, and for the first time since Catherine's death, Richard Whitman allowed himself to believe that his daughter might find her way back to some version of the person she had been before tragedy redefined everything about their family's existence. The phone call came on Tuesday morning, while David was replacing a water heater in a modest ranch house across town, his hands covered in pipe joint compound and his mind focused on the technical challenges of working with aging plumbing systems. Mrs. Henderson's voice was carefully professional, as always, but there was something different in her tone as she explained that they needed him to return to the estate, not for emergency repairs this time, but because Amelia had specifically asked when. the man with the little girl, would be coming back. The request was so unprecedented that the housekeeper seemed almost afraid to believe it herself, her words chosen with the precision of someone reporting a medical miracle to skeptical doctors. David found himself strangely nervous as he drove back to Greenwich that afternoon, Sophie chattering beside him about the art project she had planned to share with her new friend. The weight of unexpected responsibility settled on his shoulders. Somehow, without trying or intending, he had become important to a grieving girl whose father could afford to hire anyone in the world to help her heal. The pressure was enormous and completely outside his area of expertise, but Sophie's unconscious confidence reminded him that sometimes the most important qualifications couldn't be purchased or credentialed. Amelia was waiting for them in the kitchen, her appearance noticeably different from their first encounter. She had showered and changed clothes, small signs of self-care that Mrs. Henderson later confided were the first she had exhibited in weeks. More importantly, she had prepared for their visit by gathering art supplies, not expensive professional materials, but simple colored pencils and sketch paper that she had requested from the housekeeper. The gesture suggested planning and anticipation, evidence of engagement with future possibility that had been completely absent from her life since the accident. Their second session unfolded more naturally than the first, without the awkwardness of unexpected encounter or the distraction of emergency plumbing repairs. Sophie immediately launched into an enthusiastic description of her latest artistic discoveries, sharing techniques she had learned from library books and experiments she had conducted with different materials. Her teaching style was entirely unconscious, the natural sharing of one creative person with another, free from the careful theoretical frameworks that had made professional therapy feel sterile and artificial to Amelia. David found himself observing more than participating, watching as his daughter's enthusiasm gradually drew responses from the older girl. Amelia's contributions were tentative at first, single words, nodded agreements, careful questions about technique or color choice. But as the afternoon progressed, she began offering her own observations and suggestions, drawing on artistic knowledge that had been dormant but not destroyed by her months of withdrawal from the world. There was a sophistication to her understanding of composition and color theory that suggested formal training, though she seemed to have forgotten that she possessed these skills until Sophie's encouragement helped her rediscover them. The breakthrough came when Sophie asked Amelia to help her draw something sad, explaining that she sometimes needed to make pictures of difficult feelings in order to understand them better. It was exactly the kind of therapeutic technique that expensive professionals had tried to impose on Amelia for months, but coming from a 7-year-old with genuine curiosity rather than clinical agenda, the request felt safe enough to consider. Amelia's first sad drawing was tentative. Grey clouds and drooping flowers rendered in careful, controlled strokes that suggested deep emotion held tightly in check. But Sophie's response was immediate and empathetic, sharing her own sad drawings and explaining how making pictures of difficult feelings sometimes helped them feel less heavy and overwhelming. The two girls bent over their sketchbooks together, creating visual representations of grief and loss that were far more honest and effective than anything that had emerged from months of expensive therapeutic interventions. David watched from his position at the kitchen counter, ostensibly working on pipe fittings, but actually serving as witness to a kind of healing that couldn't be purchased or prescribed. By their third visit, patterns had begun to establish themselves around their unlikely friendship. Amelia would be waiting in the kitchen when they arrived, art supplies arranged with increasing confidence and creativity. Sophie would immediately begin sharing whatever artistic adventure had captured her imagination during the week, her enthusiasm creating an atmosphere of possibility that made even difficult topics feel manageable. And David would find ways to contribute without overwhelming the delicate dynamic between the two girls, his presence steady and supportive without being intrusive or demanding. The real transformation became evident when Amelia began asking questions about David and Sophie's life outside the mansion walls. Her curiosity was careful but genuine, focused on understanding how people navigated loss and continued creating joy despite difficult circumstances. She wanted to know about their small apartment, about Sophie's school and friends, about the routines and rituals that gave structure to days when grief threatened to make everything feel meaningless. These weren't the idle questions of someone making conversation, but the desperate inquiries of someone trying to learn how to live again. David answered her questions with the same careful honesty he had used with Sophie during their own journey through grief, avoiding both false optimism and overwhelming despair. He talked about the daily choice to get up and show up, about finding meaning in small responsibilities and simple pleasures. He described the way that loving someone who had died required learning new ways to carry that love forward, transforming it from active relationship into enduring presence that could guide and comfort without overwhelming. His words were simple and practical, free from the complex theoretical frameworks that had made previous therapeutic attempts feel academic rather than applicable. Sophie contributed her own perspective with the startling wisdom that sometimes came from minds too young to understand why things had to be complicated. She talked about missing her mother, while still being able to feel happy about other things, about drawing pictures of Maria in heaven that helped her feel connected across the divide of death. Her approach to grief was simultaneously more sophisticated and more innocent than anything Amelia had encountered in months of professional counseling, offering hope without denying pain and possibility without minimizing loss. The session that changed everything happened on a rainy Thursday, when Sophie brought her most treasured possession to share, a small watercolor set that had belonged to her mother, carefully preserved since Maria's death 2 years earlier. She offered to let Amelia use the paints with the generous spirit that characterized all her interactions, unconscious of the magnitude of what she was sharing. For Amelia, who hadn't touched her own mother's art supplies since the accident, the gesture was both terrifying and irresistible, representing everything she had lost and everything she still might be able to recover. They painted together that afternoon while rain drummed against the mansion's windows, their watercolors bleeding and blending on paper that absorbed both pigment and tears. Amelia's first attempts were hesitant and controlled, careful landscapes that revealed technical skill but little emotional engagement. But Sophie's encouragement and example gradually drew out something more vulnerable and true, colors that captured not just visual reality, but internal experience. By the end of the session, Amelia had created her first honest artistic expression since her mother's death, a painting that acknowledged both loss and beauty, pain and possibility, all coexisting in the same complex emotional landscape. When Mrs. Henderson discovered them hours later, covered in paint and surrounded by drying artwork, she found herself crying for the first time since Catherine's funeral. The sight of Amelia, engaged and creative and genuinely present, was so unprecedented that it felt like witnessing a resurrection, a return to life after months of existing as a ghost in her own home. She called Richard immediately, her voice thick with emotion, as she tried to convey the magnitude of what she had witnessed without overstating or raising false hopes. Richard Whitman's return from his latest business trip coincided with their 4th Saturday session, and he arrived home to find his kitchen transformed into an art studio filled with laughter and creative energy that the house hadn't contained since Catherine's death. The sight of his daughter, truly present and engaged with other people for the first time in 6 months, brought tears to his eyes that he quickly brushed away. But even as relief flooded through him, Richard felt a stab of something that might have been jealousy or inadequacy, the uncomfortable recognition that strangers had accomplished what he had failed to achieve despite unlimited resources and desperate love. He waited until David and Sophie had gone home before approaching Amelia, his heart pounding with the fear that addressing what had happened might somehow break whatever spell had brought her back to life. but his daughter looked up at him with eyes that held more light than he had seen since the accident, her face animated with the kind of enthusiasm he had thought was lost forever. She wanted to show him the paintings she had created, to explain the techniques Sophie had taught her, to share the joy of rediscovering creativity in the midst of grief. Richard listened with the careful attention of someone who understood that he was being given a precious gift, his daughter's trust and enthusiasm after months of careful distance and protective silence. But underneath his relief and gratitude, questions multiplied like storm clouds. How had a maintenance worker and his 7-year-old daughter succeeded where teams of expensive professionals had failed? What did they possess that he, with all his resources and desperate love, had been unable to provide? The questions weren't entirely rational, but they reflected his growing understanding that money and credentials might not be the solution to every problem that mattered. The confrontation he planned was careful and controlled, scheduled for the following Tuesday when David would return alone to complete some follow-up plumbing work. Richard waited in the kitchen like a corporate executive, preparing for a difficult negotiation, his expensive suit and controlled demeanor masking the emotional turmoil beneath. When David arrived with his familiar toolbox and unpretentious manner, Richard felt the full weight of the contrast between their worlds, one built on wealth and achievement, the other on honest work and simple human connection. "Mr. Mitchell," Richard began, without preamble, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to controlling conversations and outcomes. "I need to understand what's happening here. My daughter has been through extensive trauma therapy with some of the most qualified professionals available, yet you and your daughter have achieved more progress in 4 visits than we've seen in 6 months. I'm grateful, but I'm also concerned about the lack of professional oversight in whatever process is occurring." David set down his toolbox and studied Richard's face, recognizing the mixture of desperation and suspicion that characterized parents who had exhausted traditional options without finding solutions. "I understand your concern, Mr. Whitman. You want to make sure Amelia is getting appropriate help, and you have every right to question the qualifications of anyone involved in her care. I'm not a therapist or counselor. I'm just a maintenance worker whose daughter happens to connect well with yours." Richard's expression suggested this response confirmed, rather than alleviated, his concerns. "That's exactly what worries me. Amelia is extremely vulnerable right now, and well-meaning amateurs could potentially cause significant harm even with the best intentions. What happens if this friendship ends badly? What happens if you say or do something that triggers a setback? I can't afford to take risks with my daughter's mental health based on good intentions and amateur psychology." The criticism stung more than David cared to admit, not because it was unfair, but because it highlighted the vast distance between their circumstances and capabilities. Richard Whitman could afford to hire anyone in the world to help his daughter, while David struggled to pay for Sophie's school supplies and relied on community resources for most of their needs. But he had learned something in his own journey through grief that all the money in the world couldn't purchase. The understanding that healing often happened in ordinary moments between people who cared about each other without agenda or expectation. "You're absolutely right to be protective of Amelia," David said quietly, his hands steady as he began unpacking his tools despite the tension crackling between them. "She's been through something traumatic, and she needs people around her who understand the gravity of that experience. But I think you're asking the wrong questions about what's happening here." Richard's eyebrows rose slightly, his corporate instincts bristling at the suggestion that his analysis might be flawed. "What questions should I be asking?" David paused in his work, choosing his words carefully because he understood that this conversation would determine whether their unlikely friendship could continue. "Maybe instead of asking about professional qualifications, you should ask why Amelia feels safe enough with Sophie to engage in ways she hasn't with trained therapists. Maybe instead of worrying about credentials, you should consider what's different about interactions that feel natural and voluntary versus those that feel clinical and imposed." The suggestion clearly unsettled Richard, challenging assumptions about expertise and control that had guided most of his adult decisions. "Are you saying that expensive therapy is worthless? That professional training doesn't matter when dealing with serious psychological trauma?" "I'm saying that healing happens in relationship, and relationships can't be purchased or prescribed," David replied, his voice gaining strength as he found words for truths he had learned through experience rather than education. "Sophie doesn't try to fix Amelia or manage her grief or guide her through predetermined stages of recovery. She just shows up with art supplies and genuine interest, creating space for whatever Amelia needs to express or explore." Richard began pacing the kitchen, his agitation evident in the sharp clicks of expensive shoes against marble flooring. But what if it's not enough? What if friendship and art therapy aren't sufficient to address the depth of her trauma? What if she needs medication or intensive treatment or residential care? I can't base my daughter's recovery on hope and good intentions. David understood the fear beneath Richard's questions, the terror of a parent who had already lost his wife and couldn't bear the thought of losing his daughter to unreachable grief. "I'm not suggesting that professional help doesn't have value or that friendship can solve every problem. I'm just saying that maybe Amelia needs both: clinical support and genuine human connection, professional expertise, and simple presence. Maybe the question isn't whether Sophie and I are qualified enough, but whether we can work together with other resources to create the best possible environment for her healing." The suggestion of collaboration rather than replacement seemed to shift something in Richard's demeanor, offering a path forward that didn't require him to choose between professional competence and proven results. "You would be willing to coordinate with her therapists, to work within a more structured framework while maintaining whatever connection has been so beneficial?" David nodded, recognizing that Richard's need for control and professional oversight came from love rather than arrogance. "Of course, the only thing that matters is what helps Amelia heal and find ways to engage with life again. If that means working with therapists and following clinical recommendations, Sophie and I are completely supportive of that approach." Richard stopped pacing and looked directly at David for the first time since the conversation began, seeing not a threat to his authority, but a potential ally in the most important work of his life. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I've been so focused on finding the right professionals and controlling the process that I forgot the most important factor: what actually helps my daughter feel safe and hopeful again." The admission cost Richard significant effort, requiring him to acknowledge that his wealth and connections hadn't been sufficient to solve the problem that mattered most to him. But it also opened space for a different kind of relationship, one based on shared commitment to Amelia's well-being rather than competition over approaches or credentials. Their collaboration began the following Saturday when Richard joined their art session for the first time, his expensive casual clothes and nervous energy creating an almost comical contrast to the relaxed creativity that had characterized previous meetings. Amelia's surprise at seeing her father with a sketchbook was matched only by Sophie's delight at having a new student to instruct in the basics of artistic expression. The dynamic shifted as Richard struggled with the unfamiliar vulnerability of creating something imperfect in front of others, his corporate confidence completely absent when faced with blank paper and colored pencils. Sophie took charge of his artistic education with the patient enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved sharing knowledge, explaining basic concepts of color and composition with the seriousness of a master craftsman. Richard's first attempts were predictably controlled and geometric, reflecting his engineering background and discomfort with ambiguity or imperfection. But Sophie's encouragement and Amelia's gentle coaching gradually helped him understand that art wasn't about technical precision, but about honest expression, about using visual language to communicate things that words couldn't capture. The breakthrough came when Amelia asked her father to draw his favorite memory of her mother, a request that struck him like a physical blow. His hand trembled as he began sketching tentative lines, memories flooding back of Catherine at the piano, her face luminous with joy as music filled their home with warmth and life. The resulting drawing was crude and disproportionate, but it captured something essential about love and loss that no amount of technical skill could have improved. David watched the session unfold with the careful attention of someone who understood that family healing required space for everyone to be vulnerable and imperfect together. Richard's willingness to look foolish in front of his daughter, to struggle with unfamiliar challenges while she offered gentle guidance, created a new dynamic between them that professional therapy had never achieved. For the first time since Catherine's death, father and daughter were learning something together, sharing the frustration and joy of creative discovery in ways that felt natural rather than imposed. As weeks passed, their Saturday sessions became the anchor point around which the Whitman family's recovery began to organize itself. Richard rearranged his travel schedule to be present for every meeting, learning to find satisfaction in small artistic improvements rather than major business victories. Amelia began speaking more freely, not just about art, but about her memories of her mother, her fears about the future, a growing sense that life might contain possibilities beyond grief and loss. The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden. There were still difficult days when Amelia retreated to her room, still moments when Richard's instinct for control created tension, still sessions when grief overwhelmed their carefully constructed optimism. But gradually, incrementally, something resembling hope began to take root in soil that had seemed too damaged to support new growth. They were becoming a family again, not the same family they had been before Catherine's death, but a new configuration that honored their loss while insisting on the possibility of future joy. Mrs. Henderson watched these changes with the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed a miracle unfold in ordinary time through ordinary means. The house began to feel alive again, filled with voices and laughter and the comfortable mess that accompanied genuine human habitation. Sketches appeared on the refrigerator, paint stains marked the furniture, and conversations extended beyond politeness into real engagement with ideas and experiences that mattered. The crisis that tested their new stability came on a Tuesday afternoon when Richard returned unexpectedly from a business trip to find their kitchen converted into an impromptu art studio, papers and supplies scattered across every surface, while Amelia worked on her most ambitious painting yet. His first instinct was irritation at the mess and disruption, months of careful household management apparently abandoned in favor of creative chaos. But something in his daughter's posture, the focused intensity, the unconscious joy in her movements, stopped his criticism before it could form into words. Amelia was painting her mother, not from photographs but from memory and imagination, creating a portrait that captured Catherine's essence rather than her physical appearance. The technique was sophisticated, showing artistic skills that had been developing quietly during their months of informal instruction, but more importantly, the emotional content was honest and complex. This wasn't idealization or denial, but a mature artistic attempt to hold love and loss simultaneously. To honor her mother's life while acknowledging the reality of death, Richard stood in the doorway watching his daughter work, understanding that he was witnessing something sacred that deserved protection rather than management. When Amelia finally noticed his presence, her face showed no embarrassment or apology for the mess she had created, only the quiet confidence of someone engaged in meaningful work. She invited him to look at the painting, to offer his own memories of Catherine's appearance and personality, to participate in the creative process of remembering and honoring someone they had both loved deeply. Their conversation that afternoon was different from any they had shared since Catherine's death, focused not on Amelia's symptoms or progress, but on their shared love for someone who continued to matter despite being gone. Richard found himself contributing details about Catherine's expressions and gestures, helping Amelia refine her artistic tribute, while sharing stories and memories that had been too painful to voice for months. They worked together until long after dark, father and daughter collaborating on a project that honored their past while asserting their commitment to continuing forward together. When David and Sophie arrived for their regular Saturday session, they found the painting displayed prominently in the kitchen, surrounded by preliminary sketches and color studies that documented Amelia's artistic process. The transformation in both father and daughter was immediately evident. Richard moved through the space with new comfort and ownership, while Amelia demonstrated techniques and explained creative choices with the confidence of someone who had rediscovered her own competence and vision. Sophie's response to the portrait was characteristically direct and emotionally intelligent, commenting on the way Amelia had captured not just how Catherine looked, but how she felt to people who loved her. The observation sparked a conversation about the difference between realistic representation and emotional truth, about the ways that art could communicate things that photographs or literal descriptions couldn't capture. David listened with the pleasure of someone watching others discover truths he had learned through his own creative practice, understanding that artistic expression was becoming a language that allowed this family to communicate about their deepest experiences. By the end of that session, they had established new patterns that would carry them forward. Richard's participation was no longer tentative or apologetic, but genuine and engaged, his business instincts channeled into supporting rather than controlling his daughter's recovery. Amelia had found her voice not just as an artist, but as a family member, contributing to decisions about their shared life with opinions and preferences that had been absent for months. And their relationship with David and Sophie had evolved from emergency intervention to chosen family, a connection that would continue not because it was therapeutically necessary, but because it had become personally meaningful to everyone involved. The healing wasn't complete, and never would be. Catherine's absence would always be felt, and grief would continue to surface in unexpected moments and situations. But they had learned to carry their loss differently, as a shared burden that could be transformed through creative expression and honest relationship into something that honored their love while permitting new joy to coexist with enduring sorrow. 6 months later, the Whitman mansion hummed with the kind of life that money couldn't purchase, but that had grown naturally from their commitment to healing, together through art and authentic relationship. The kitchen had been permanently reconfigured to accommodate their weekly art sessions, its marble surfaces protected by canvas drop cloths that bore the colorful evidence of countless creative experiments. Sketches and paintings covered the refrigerator and bulletin boards throughout the house, creating a visual diary of their journey from isolation toward connection, from despair toward qualified hope. Richard had developed into a surprisingly competent amateur artist, his technical precision serving him well once he learned to combine it with emotional honesty and creative risk-taking. His business travel had been dramatically reduced, not because his companies required less attention, but because he had redefined his priorities around presence and relationship rather than achievement and acquisition. The merger deals and expansion plans that had once consumed his attention seemed less urgent when measured against Saturday afternoon painting sessions and evening conversations with his daughter about art and life, and the ongoing process of learning to carry love forward after loss. Amelia had returned to school and begun participating in extracurricular activities, her artistic abilities earning recognition and creating new friendships with peers who shared her creative interests. But more importantly, she had rediscovered her own voice and agency, contributing to family decisions and expressing opinions and preferences that had been dormant during her months of protective withdrawal. Her relationship with her father had evolved into something deeper and more authentic than it had been even before the accident, built on shared vulnerability and mutual respect, rather than traditional parent-child dynamics. The transformation was perhaps most evident in small daily interactions, conversations over breakfast about art projects and school activities, collaborative decisions about weekend plans and vacation destinations, easy laughter, and comfortable silence that indicated genuine comfort with each other's presence. They had become a family again, not the same family they had been when Catherine was alive, but a new configuration that honored their loss while insisting on their right to continued happiness and growth. David and Sophie had become permanent fixtures in their lives, chosen family members whose weekly visits provided continuity and support that extended far beyond their original emergency intervention. Sophie's artistic development had accelerated under Amelia's mentorship, her natural talent refined by instruction from someone who understood both technical skill and emotional expression. The age difference between the girls had become irrelevant as their friendship deepened, based on shared creative passion and mutual appreciation rather than conventional social expectations. Their final scene took place on a spring afternoon that would have been Catherine's 44th birthday, the four of them working together on a collaborative mural that covered one entire wall of the sunroom. The painting depicted a garden full of wildflowers and fruit trees, paths that wound through beautiful landscape toward distant mountains that suggested journey and possibility. Each of them had contributed elements that reflected their individual personalities and artistic strengths, but the overall composition was unified and harmonious, a visual representation of their shared commitment to growth and beauty despite difficult circumstances. As they worked, conversation flowed easily between technical discussions of color and composition and deeper reflections on healing and hope, on the ways that creativity could transform suffering into something meaningful and beautiful. Catherine's presence was felt, but not overwhelming, a gentle influence that encouraged their continued growth rather than trapping them in memorial obligation. They had learned to carry their love for her forward in ways that honored her memory while permitting their own lives to flourish and expand. When the afternoon light began to fade and their work session drew to its natural conclusion, they stood together, admiring what they had created. Not just the mural, but the relationships and healing that had grown from their willingness to sit on floors together and create beauty from broken pieces. The expensive therapists and professional interventions had failed, not because they lacked skill or credentials, but because healing required something that couldn't be purchased or prescribed: the willingness to be present with pain until it transformed into wisdom, to create meaning from loss through honest relationship and shared creative expression. Sometimes the most profound healing came not from the most qualified hands, but from the most caring hearts willing to sit on marble floors and teach each other how to draw hope from the depths of despair. As they walked back to the car, Grace skipping ahead while Tom and Maggie followed hand in hand, Tom realized that Anna had given them the most precious gift imaginable: the courage to love again without reservation, the wisdom to build new happiness without destroying old memories, and the understanding that families could expand and evolve without losing their essential character. The emergency room where they'd first met felt like a lifetime ago, but Tom could still remember the exact moment when Maggie had recognized Anna's paint box and spoken his wife's name with the familiarity of someone who had earned the right to remember her out loud. In the growing dusk of a Millbrook evening, walking toward a future that held promise instead of just survival, Tom understood that some stories don't end with loss, but begin with it, using grief as a foundation for joy that runs deeper because it acknowledges the cost of loving fully. Grace's laughter echoed off the cemetery walls like music, and Maggie's hand in his felt like coming home to a place he'd never known existed. Anna's gift to them hadn't been a replacement for what they'd lost, but an expansion of what they'd thought possible: love that multiplied instead of diminished, hope that grew stronger because it had been tested by the worst life could offer. The paint box sat safely in Grace's backpack, no longer a relic of the past, but a tool for creating futures Anna could only have dreamed of, colors mixed with intention and applied with the confidence that comes from understanding that beauty is not diminished by sadness but made more precious because of it. The last visitors departed as darkness settled over the city, leaving the gallery space peaceful and warm in the glow of carefully positioned lighting that accommodated various sensory processing needs. Ruby had fallen asleep curled up next to her latest color study, while Jasper continued working on mathematical calculations for their next collaborative project. Zoe was reading quietly in a corner, occasionally looking up to observe the comfortable domesticity of their unconventional family gathering. Helena began the gentle process of transitioning the children toward home and bedtime routines, her movements carrying the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to create structure without rigidity, accommodation without chaos. Benjamin gathered art supplies and turned off equipment, his hands moving through familiar patterns that had become meditative rather than merely functional. As they prepared to leave the gallery space that had become the visible symbol of their commitment to honoring neurodivergent gifts, Benjamin paused to look once more at the children's collaborative installation. The piece seemed to pulse with its own internal light, geometric patterns and flowing colors, creating a visual representation of minds working together in harmony rather than competition. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: funding applications and research collaborations, therapeutic sessions with children whose gifts hadn't yet been recognized, conversations with educators and parents who were beginning to understand that different didn't necessarily mean deficient. But tonight, surrounded by the quiet evidence of healing and creativity and love that had emerged from their willingness to risk authentic connection, Benjamin Mitchell felt the deep satisfaction of someone who'd finally learned to stop hiding from his own gifts and the people who needed them most. The drive home through the quiet city streets was filled with the comfortable silence of a family that had learned to communicate through presence as much as words, their different ways of processing and expressing emotion woven together into something resilient and beautiful and entirely their own. And in the peaceful breathing of children who finally felt safe enough to sleep deeply, Benjamin could hear the echo of Luna's voice, reminding him that the most important art was always the kind that helped other people remember they weren't alone in the world.